Today, we will be talking about the redundancy principle as noted in Chapter 7 of E-Learning and the Science of Instruction, Proven Guidelines for Consumers and Designers of Multimedia Learning by Ruth C. Clark and Richard E. Mayer, the originator of Mayer's 12 Principles of Multimedia Learning. This presentation was created as a joint effort by Masha Bubella, Gina Quid, Eva Marie Lee, and Kelly Perry. It is being presented today by Eva Marie Lee. This presentation will go over the characteristics of the guidelines of the redundancy principle, take a look at the cognitive reasonings, examples of support, and violations, as well as situational questions to aid in understanding. The first part of the redundancy principle is that we should not add on-screen text to narrated graphics. In the image on the screen, you see a bar graph and narration notes with the words "this" below. On the right side, there is a bar graph, narration notes, and on-screen text to duplicate the narration notes. At the bottom of the right side, there are the words, "not this." When there is narration or voiceover, use only graphics on the screen, with possible addition of a few key terms for reinforcement. Don't use graphics and narration simultaneously with full text. Within our 5 senses in online learning, there are 2 that are active, the visual channel and the auditory channel. Remember that our working memories only carry about 5 to 9 pieces of information at a time. What we really want to do is to allow our learners to focus on processing the instructional material. And to do this, they must make sense out of what we put on the screen. But if we have the visual channel competing for space and processing time within the working memory, they may be losing comprehension due to distracted or divided attention. On the other hand, learners will compare and reconcile the on-screen text with the narration, requiring more cognitive processing and aiding depth of comprehension. Remember, we don't want the information to compete. We want to reinforce. You may ask how subtitles or closed captioning on the bottom of the screen works with redundancy principle. Wouldn't that distract the learner? Never use redundancy principle as a reason to remove captions. First, a learner who is deaf would not be able to hear the narrated sound, so they rely on necessary subtitles. But you can add the ability to turn the captioning on and off. The image on screen is a series of 3-wheel cogs. In the first, there is a loudspeaker and an eye. In the second, there is a frown emoticon, and in the third, there is a link icon. With this, let's further explore the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, which is based on the assumptions that 1. All people have separate channels for processing verbal and pictorial material. 2. Each channel is limited in the amount of processing that can take place at one time. And 3. Learners actively attempt to build pictorial and verbal models from the presented material and build connections between them. According to the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, adding redundant on-screen text to a multimedia presentation could overload the visual channel, creating what is called extraneous cognitive load. Cognitive processing that does not serve an instructional objective but wastes limited processing capacity. To remove this extraneous load, remove redundant information. Now, let us look at the experimental evidence supporting redundancy principle 1. In 1999 to 2000, Kalyuga, Chandler, and Sweller performed an experiment involving electrical engineering students, specifically training and soldering. The non-redundant group was presented with static diagrams on a computer screen along with accompanying speech. Contrastingly, the redundant group received the same training along with on-screen printed text duplicating the same words as the audio. On a problem-solving transfer test involving troubleshooting, the non-redundant group outperformed the redundant group, producing an effect size of 0.8 in one study and greater than 1 in another. Adding text and narration in this situation adds to extraneous cognitive load. In a set of studies involving a multimedia lesson on lighting, Some students, the non-redundant group, viewed an animation or slideshow and listened to a concurrent narration explaining the formation of lightning. Other students, the redundant group, received the same narrated presentation, but with concurrent, redundant on-screen text added. In this series of 8 experimental comparisons, students in the non-redundant group produced more solutions on a problem-solving transfer test than did students in the redundant group, yielding a median effect size greater than 1, which is considered to be large. This chart shows the result from one of these studies. On the screen, you see a bar graph for the percent correct on a transfer test. The bar representing with narration shows 40%, and the bar representing with narration and text shows 20%, or half of the bar with narration only. This supports Redundancy Principle 1 with empirical evidence showing that people learn better from concurrent graphics and audio narration than from concurrent graphics, audio, and on-screen text. The message remains consistent across the research. Do not add printed text to narrated graphics. This slide shows a violation example of Redundancy Principle 1 with a microphone graphic, a speech bubble with the word narration, and on-screen text crossed out. The redundancy principle suggests that redundant material interferes with rather than facilitates learning. Redundancy occurs when the same information is presented concurrently in multiple forms or is unnecessarily elaborated. Question time. On screen, you see a multicolored bar graph with each bar from left to right stepped up and an arrow moving in a positive slope. I will state the question twice to give you time to consider your answer. In a staff meeting, the Director of Sales and Services was excited to present these results of their latest marketing campaign that occurred over the last 6 months. In consideration of the redundancy principle, if you were designing the multimedia presentation for the director, would you need to add text to this slide? Why or why not? Again, in a staff meeting, the Director of Sales and Services was excited to present these results of their latest marketing campaign that occurred over the last 6 months. In consideration of the redundancy principle, if you were designing the multimedia presentation for the director, would you need to add text to this slide? Why or why not? Do you have an answer? Okay, let's check. The image on screen is the same image as the previous screen. The answer for the question is no, but it's not a resounding no. First, the audience is familiar with the topic and may already know the numbers and the months. Second, the graphic with the director's narration will be clear enough. Any added text would deter from its simplicity. But what if he were presenting to the board members, who are very interested in the numbers? If I were to add text, it would be the dollar amounts. Perhaps I would only put the first and last numbers, reducing excessive cognitive load, but still signaling an important piece of information to reinforce how well the director's division performed in this past half year. But this is where it's important to know your audience. Similar to the reason I might wish to add numbers. Did I need to add the no on this slide? Why do you think I did? For the answer to this question, let's look at Principle 2. You see, graphics and narration without on-screen text is not a die-hard rule. There are exceptions. So the second principle is consider adding on-screen text to narration in special situations. The special situations are what the authors called boundary conditions. First, when there are no graphics, the visual channel is free to consider text. Second, when the lesson is slow or self-paced, the learner can spend as much time as needed to consider the text. Third, if the words are too complex, technical, or unfamiliar, then the transitory nature of narration may delay comprehension before the instructor moves on. It is better, in these cases, to have the words printed on screen. Finally, if the text is short, it may not compete as much with graphics in the visual channel, and it may cue the learner to pay attention to those parts of their narration. At the same time, if you use the text on screen, you don't necessarily need to narrate those words. Avoid narrating the on-screen text if you have both words and pictures. If the lesson is slow or self-paced, if there are no pictures, if there are only a few signal or keywords with the graphic, and if the learner is unfamiliar with the words and may have difficulty processing their narration, then definitely narrate the on-screen text as well. When talking about accessibility, where the narration is not able to be heard, it is important to provide captions so that all learners have access to the material. The redundancy principle is one reason that we also need to be able to turn on and off the captions, and allow the learners who must read captions as well to be able to use navigation controls to have control of the lesson. Also, though the text suggests directions for an exercise or other text referenced over time being used without narration, these would not be accessible to someone with visual impairments. The image on screen is a traffic signal. It represents signaling, that is, printing a few key words next to the graphic or otherwise highlighting important information which cues the learner's attention to their importance and aids in cognitive processing. This is one method of dual modes of presentation. Using dual modes of presentation can be helpful when the spoken material may be hard to process, or if seeing and hearing the words provides a benefit. Cases in which dual mode presentation is beneficial: presenting concurrent narration, on-screen text, and static graphics under learner control, printing unfamiliar technical terms on screen, and signaling, printing a few keywords next to the graphic. Now we are going to explore an example showing the experimental evidence for including redundant on-screen text. In 2008, Mayer and Johnson compared the learning outcomes of students who learned about lightning formation from an online slide presentation with illustrations and narration, the non-redundant group, or the same lesson with each slide containing a few printed words placed next to the corresponding part of the illustration, the redundant group. The redundant group significantly outperformed the non-redundant group on retention and performed no worse on transfer. In this image taken from the chapter and revised for better perception, there are a series of cells on the left identifying parts of the lessons in Unit 2. Working with formulas, and objectives are given. The original image notes that there is an audio version. In this version, instead of saying lesson objectives, the narrator says, "At the end of this lesson you will be able to," and then states the objectives as they are on screen. This is a supportive example of redundancy principle because there are no graphics. It is very likely that this is a self-paced lesson. It may also contain unfamiliar keywords, so placing the text and then giving a narration of the text is beneficial for learners who speak other languages or who may have cognitive disabilities. The first image on this slide is a presenter standing in front of a volcano graphic, stating the vent of the volcano spews up a dust cloud. The second image is the violation image, where the presenter stands in front of the volcano graphic and narrates the same statement, which is also printed on screen. This is an example of a violation of redundancy principle 2. The verbal material is not complex and it contains familiar keywords, so it does not need the on-screen text. The narrator's simple statement is enough to understand the material. Again, this may be an example of knowing your audience. If a young elementary audience was unfamiliar with the term vent, a label may be needed to place near the vent. It's question time. Like the last question, I will state the question twice to give you time to consider your answer. On screen, you see a multicolored brain. It is divided by color into 5 distinct areas. An Introduction to Neuroscience professor uses this image to talk about the parts of the brain. He wants to talk about the cerebellum, the occipital lobe, the hippocampus, the amygdala, the parietal lobe, the frontal lobe, the basal ganglia, the cerebral cortex, and the temporal lobe, among other areas. In a 90-minute class, he intends to cover about 25 areas. Based on the redundancy principle 2, should the professor add text to this image? What is your reasoning? Again, in Introduction, the neuroscience professor uses this image to talk about the parts of the brain. He wants to talk about the cerebellum, the occipital lobe, the hippocampus, the amygdala, the parietal lobe, the frontal lobe, the basal ganglia, the cerebral cortex, and the temporal lobe, among other areas. In a 90-minute class, he intends to cover about 25 areas. Based on the redundancy principle 2, should the professor add text to this image? What is your reasoning? Do you have your answer? Okay, let's check. The same image as the last slide is on the screen. In a fast-paced course with complex or technical terms, it helps if the image has brief bits of text. Should all 25 terms be on the same slide? No. I would definitely recommend 25 slides with one term each that he can go through as he talks about each area. And that way, the students can focus on one area at a time, thereby reducing the cognitive load. So in a nutshell, place on-screen graphics and text with intention to aid learner comprehension. Do not overload your students' precious cognitive resources by using unnecessary text.